Welcome back to my channel, everyone. In this video, we're going to find out what we need to do to get registered in Australia as a nurse or a midwife. Let's get into it. So as you can see, I'm in the section that talks about internationally qualified nurses and midwives. So before you apply, let's find out what you need to know before you apply for registration in Australia. If you're an internationally qualified nurse or midwife and are interested in working in Australia, it is important you review the following information about immigration to Australia and registration and employment as a nurse or midwife. To work as a nurse or midwife in Australia, you need to apply for and be registered with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia. You may also need to apply for a visa issued by the Australian Department of Home Affairs. These two application processes are entirely separate, and success in one does not automatically guarantee success in the other. It is important to note that you do not make any irreversible decisions, such as resigning from your current employment or moving to Australia, until you have applied for and been approved for registration by the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia. The time frame to process your application for registration depends on the unique circumstances of your application. Let's go to this section and find out the difference between the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Accreditation Council and the Nursing and Midwifery Board assessments. So here it says that the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Accreditation Council is an independent organization that performs skill assessments for migration purposes. This organization assesses the skills of internationally qualified nurses who want to migrate to Australia under the General Skilled Migration Program. The Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency assesses the application for registration from international qualified nurses and midwives on behalf of the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia. So, for you to get registered by the Unmark, they have to consider your work experience in assessing your qualifications, which is then used to determine suitability for skilled migration. Under the national law, this organization can only take into account your qualifications when establishing whether your qualifications are sustainably equivalent to Australian qualifications. This is why some applicants may be approved for skilled migration but do not meet the registration requirements of the they do not meet the requirements of the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia. International applicants must meet the registration standards and qualification criteria in order to be eligible for registration. How do you meet registration requirements? Internationally qualified nurses and midwives who apply for registration with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia are assessed against the National and Midwifery Board of Australia. Wow. Registration standards. Internationally qualified nurses and midwives are assessed against 3 qualification criteria of the assessment model. Registration standards define the requirements that applicants must meet to be considered fit to practice as nurses and midwives. Qualification criteria defines the minimum acceptable education and training that internationally qualified nurses must have completed. Okay, let's find out. We're back where we were before, and we're going to look at employment. Neither the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency nor the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia are involved in employment matters and are therefore unable to assist you in seeking employment or influencing employment outcomes. However, it is important to be aware that any health practitioner must hold registration with the relevant national board prior to taking up employment in Australia in their profession. We recommend that you do not apply for work until your registration eligibility is confirmed. So I think what they're trying to say is the first step before you apply for work in Australia or resign from your current job overseas is to make sure that you're registered and that you qualify to be registered to work in Australia. Below is a recommended pathway to employment in Australia for internationally qualified nurses and midwives. So the first step, assess your ability to meet the registration requirements. Second step, assess your ability to meet the immigration requirements. Next step, complete a self-check. So this self-check has 2 streams. If stream A is successfully completed, you can go ahead and fill in the application form and provide documentation to the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency. And then the Nursing and Midwifery Board will assess whether you meet the requirements for registration. Then you will receive your registration. After you receive your registration, you can apply for a visa to immigrate to Australia. Once you apply for a visa and you are granted a visa, you can then apply for employment or apply for a job in Australia. Once you've been accepted for a job in Australia, you can immigrate to Australia and begin working. On the other hand, with stream B, if you successfully complete the orientation part and the outcome-based assessment, you can proceed to fill in your application and provide documentation to the Australian Health Practitioner and Regulation Agency. You can then, your registration will then be assessed by the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia, whether you meet the requirements for registration. Once you qualify, you will receive registration. You can then proceed to apply for immigration to Australia. And once your visa is granted, you can apply for a job in Australia. There are 2 options. You can travel to Australia and apply for a job when you're in Australia, or you can apply for a sponsored visa while you're still overseas. So these two options here, they can be intertwined depending on your situation. I have made a video for how to obtain a sponsored visa, an employer-sponsored visa. Please look back in my previous videos. Once you receive your visa, you can immigrate to Australia and begin working. Let's have a look at self-check portfolio. If you're an internationally qualified nurse or midwife who wishes to register in Australia, you will need to complete the self-check before applying for registration. Upon completion of the self-check, the international qualified nurse applicant will be assigned to the stream. So this is where we were in the previous section, we were talking about stream A or stream B, which is dependent on which qualification assessment criteria you will meet. All internationally qualified nurses and midwives who wish to register and work in Australia as a registered nurse, enrolled nurse, or midwife must complete an orientation to Australian healthcare setting. There are two parts to the orientation. Orientation part 1 must be completed before registration, and part 2 must be completed after registration. The information provided by candidates during the self-check is checked by the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency at the portfolio stage. At this stage, candidates must provide additional personal and contact information as well as identification and qualification documents. So these are just the more details on how to complete a self-check, steps after the self-check or assessment stages, the orientation, and the portfolio or the additional document that you must provide. Examination. This stage contains detailed information regarding the examination process for enrolled nurses, registered nurses, and midwives. There is a multiple choice question exam that assesses your professional knowledge. There are separate exams for international qualified nurses and midwives intending to register in Australia as registered nurses, enrolled nurses, or midwives. Then there is the objective structured clinical exam that assesses whether you as a candidate demonstrates the knowledge, skills, and competence of a graduate level nurse or midwife from an Australian National Midwives Board agency approved program of study. I know this sounds like too much information, but I will come back again and simplify it with a fact sheet. Let's continue. Registration. Once internationally qualified nurses or midwives successfully complete the self-check and assessment stages, they are eligible to apply for registration. Once a nurse is eligible to apply for registration, the application form will be made available within the International Qualified Nurse or Midwife Candidate Dashboard. So what they're saying is you have to create an account, and in your account, you will go through these processes where you can log in and view the stage you're at. So once you complete the assessment, you go to the next stage. And they're saying that the form that you need to complete the next stage will be available in your account. So once you complete one stage, the next stage is made available for you in your account. Orientation to healthcare in Australia. As an internationally qualified nurse or midwife seeking registration in Australia, it is important that you have a good understanding of what it is like to work within the Australian healthcare system. It can be quite different to healthcare systems in other countries. The Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia has developed an orientation program to introduce internationally qualified nurses and midwives to a range of concepts relating to the Australian healthcare context. The aim is to keep the public safe by supporting international qualified nurses who register with the Nursing and Midwife Board Agency to prepare for the environment in which they will be working. So simply put, what they're saying is they will support you to adjust to the new setting and to the new work environment in Australia. The Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia orientation program has two parts. So part one is an online learning which introduces the Australian healthcare context. Part one must be completed as part of the International Qualified Nurse or Midwife assessment process after completing the self-check. Orientation part two is an online learning giving a more in-depth orientation to the Australian healthcare context. For all internationally qualified nurses and midwives who register with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia have a requirement of registration to complete part 2 within 6 months of becoming registered. Employers of registered internationally qualified nurses are expected to provide local orientation through an induction program. So this whole section is just advising you that you will be supported through your orientation, your exam, and your registration into the Australian setting. There are a number of important documents for internationally qualified nurses and midwives to use as part of the application or to refer to for information. So I won't go into this, but I will link this information in the description box below for you to refer to, and also for you to just orient yourself on what is required and what stages or steps to follow when following through your application process and your registration process. I hope this information was helpful. I will come back with a fact sheet on the same, just so that we can come and address a few questions you might have, or a few common questions that may have not been covered in this section. Thank you for your time. I'll catch you in the next one.